Claude says break.
Yes. You were too slow. It now depends on whether Sanoa is ready with the next recording. I see it's started. Good.
Yeah, started, yeah.
Okay, so I am going to go back to the document. We're at the table of contents and with the steps. So we are jumping around a little bit, and I hope that Andrew's discussion now, well, it didn't link in as much probably because that was a lot of technical depth that we haven't covered before, but that really links to the step 5 design. And that's also on both sides, but making sure that your generator actually understands what's important there and that is critical to get the protection coordination and those things like getting the timing, the sync check, to get that right between the different parties. We've done 1, 2, and 3 yesterday, so now I would just like to talk a little bit about some of the contracts. So in the document, if we go to the contracts, so this 2.4, you will see there's a whole list of short bits and pieces for all of these contracts. So there's a lot of them, but not all of them are equally, shall I say, important right now. So I've got on this presentation here, I've listed all of them that's in the document. And then we can briefly discuss them. Now I've swapped them around a little bit because the connection agreement is probably the single most important document. And that is why there is a draft connection agreement that's in this resource pack already. And that describes that interface between the customer and the generator. It is quite a hefty document, as you will see just now. One thing is, many people would probably refer to a supply agreement. And that dates back to the time when we mostly had customers and customers who consume electricity, and they were customers of the electricity. Whereas if we change that and say it's a customer of the network, and they use the network to transfer electricity in whichever direction, then supply is maybe not as applicable, and connection is probably a bit more applicable. Next thing is that the distribution code calls this connection agreement, which really looks at the information that goes before you actually do the agreement. So this is project planning data, inspection, testing, and commissioning, electrical diagrams, and other information that the distributor may require to proceed with processing this application. So it mixes this entire process from the time of application up to connection and commercial operation. So all of that seems to be contained in here. Some of the key factors, though, that would traditionally have been included in here was, for instance, power factor and reactive power requirements. The power quality is very important. Then what tariffs will be used and what would be the process to change to a different tariff, as well as the legal responsibilities at these different points. Next one is an operations agreement. This is also in terms of the grid code. The idea is that everybody understand their responsibilities. For instance, if there is a problem on the network, like overvoltage, and the distribution network operator requests that the generator curtails their output power to reduce the voltage a little bit. How should that be done? And what can be requested? So you will also see when we do the example, this actually forms an annex to the connection agreement in many cases. Then a self-build agreement, we've discussed this quite a bit. The idea would be to make sure that everybody understands the responsibilities, what specifications would be required, and how would the quality be ensured, as well as possible timelines. Once again, these timelines also is actually a request from the grid code that your customer knows what to expect. Once again, this can be either included in the connection agreement or it can be part of that budget quote acceptance fee. So you first have to, if you opt for the self-build, you have to sign this agreement, and that forms part of the quotation documentation. Implementation agreement, I think this is probably more of like a project plan with the idea to everybody has an idea of what the timelines are, which is also a grid code requirement. We've spoken about the letter of consent, and given that there's very little applications for registration or licensing going to NERSA, this would be more of an internal document. So I have checked, there is capacity on my network, the customer has or will meet my requirements, this is the assurances that I have, and all of that. So this probably falls away, but it's part of your internal checks that everything is okay. In a power purchase agreement, when we started with renewable energy, the part of the ERA, Eskom was designated as the single buyer of all electricity. So there wasn't, strictly speaking, an allowance for any of these renewable power plants to sell energy to anybody else. But wheeling has been allowed for quite some time. So, okay, so that power purchase agreement in the beginning was between the generator and Eskom. Since Eskom was the single buyer, I am aware of at least one of the round one IPP projects that was inside a municipal network, but Eskom was still the buyer. And that caught that poor municipality so off guard that there was a lot of things that NERSA wrapped them over their fingers for, which I think they weren't warned or advised in any way. So sometimes it's probably better for NERSA to say, listen, okay, let's talk about this to deal with the problems. Okay, PPA is between two independent parties. So in this case, let's say you had the customer that used to get electricity from you as the distributor. They now decide they want to actually buy from another generator. They think it might be cheaper, or they are just greenies and they want to buy renewable energy. So in this case, the contract is between these two parties in terms of the power purchase agreement, but that is definitely going to trigger at least a wheeling agreement. So through your network as the distributor, as well as an update to the connection agreement of this customer. This generator will get a connection agreement in any case, irrespective of where this electricity is going to, whether it's just going straight to the customer here, to the distributor, or to a different customer. Supply agreement, this is a term that's been used by some people, and as I understand it, that is just an older term for the connection agreement. Then there's a use of system agreement that's been extracted. Historically, this is just part of the supply or connection agreement. An example that I have seen is that you have a fairly large customer, large factory, a mine, even a residential estate. They've got some space and somebody puts up a generator on there. And then there is some use of system or wheeling type agreement between the owner of that property and the new generator. But I don't think this is very common. Typically, have your use of system agreement included in the connection agreement. I'm sure you all have seen this acronym for the connection and use of system agreement that's being used. Trading agreements. The benefit here is that you've got the trader that acts as the middleman between the generators and the customer. And this could simplify it for the distributor because now there's only one agreement that you set up with the trader. And you don't have to manage lots of them. And the trader becomes responsible to manage the agreements with the generators and the customers, as well as the use of system or wheeling agreements through your network. There's a wheeling agreement. One is that you want to include the fees and cost for using the distribution network, whereas originally the source of revenue of the networks was the electricity that was sold. Now it is actually the use of the network. So you need to look at what does it cost for somebody to use the network. We've said this morning, at least start with the avoided costs. So it's electricity that you don't have to buy from Eskom, for instance, and maybe include some losses, but this can become a very tricky technical exercise to calculate this. So once again, just start somewhere reasonable, list all your assumptions as you go along, and then you can just improve on that. A P, public-private, lost what it stands for. Public-private partnership.
Yeah, you broke up a bit. Yeah, okay. Please continue.
Okay. So the public-private partnership is, and this comes from the document, is a contract between the public sector institute and the private party. So, and then what happens is this private party actually takes over responsibilities and management and everything, operational risks for that function. Whereas the public sector, which would be the municipality or similar, pays that private party for all of these services. There are benefits because, I think there's been many case studies where it's shown that it works. There are no examples of these agreements yet, and that might be added in future. Then we have hinted at this, especially if you've got a generator that connects close to your connection point to Eskom. There might be an impact on the Eskom networks. Eskom might say, well, you now have a behind-the-meter generator that's sometimes feeding back into my network, and they might want to update that connection agreement with Eskom as well. So when I spoke to Ravi quite a while back about this, I said, okay, so at what point do you want to know about a generator inside the municipality's network? And he said, yes, of course they want to know, but he couldn't really give me that gut feel. So I think it's similar to if you've got a residential estate, at what point do you want to know about the individual generators inside their network? The environmental impacts, that is, we've discussed this yesterday. So it needs to be just checked. But most of these, the burden of proof is on the generator. So they can just give you the proofs that they've done all of that. Letter from their professional who does the environmental impacts and other, and you can just tick it off then from there. Okay, so the connection agreement, and let me pull up the template. Is also on the website. I'm going to leave this left-hand side pane open because that allows you like that index to quickly scroll through it. Let's look at the details here. So basically the 6 sections. Section A is the general, and that's like with any contract. Who are the parties? Introduction, what is it about? Your definitions, and in general, what is the agreement? The codes, other agreements, as well as the duration that this would be in force. Now let's just for interest see what codes do they refer to. Going back to this document. Zoom focus is really not good here, sorry. It's there, it's the codes. So parties acknowledge that this agreement is not intended to require either party to act in a way that would put it in breach of the codes or compliance, etc. Or licenses issued by NERSA. So if there's a problem, obviously the higher level would prevail. Okay, so that's an example and how you can quickly get to the different aspects. Then the section B speaks about the different charges. So that's a connection charge, as well as prescribed tariffs. And here we also have that early termination guarantee, if it's necessary to include, otherwise one can just omit it. Section C is probably where most people here would be interested. It's the technical requirements, not just the electrical technical requirements. It's the connection site, network performance, what your protection requirements, synchronizing. There's a lot of these things that refer to what Andrea has just spoken about. The connection to the distribution system, define the maximum export capacity, the municipality's obligations, the customer's obligations. And most of these refer back to the grid code. Then if it's necessary to have a different site for the municipality's equipment, so let's say this IPP has got their own substation, and you just bring a line to the substation. Then you need a space on their land where you can terminate the municipality's equipment. Under which conditions can you start to use this distribution system? So I know which conditions is it deemed that you've met all the requirements. And that also assists in helping that people don't just run away after commissioning. They still have to prove compliance to all the requirements. Scheduling and dispatch, especially in terms of the safe operation and correct operation of your network. I think in terms of the regional REAP programs, this actually includes something that's in the PPA about this annual grid unavailability period. So that's when there's a deemed reliability of the network. And if your network is not available at least that much of the time, and the generator can't export its power, then there might be, for instance, deemed energy costs. There's also the right to curtail or interrupt. I mean, that's just to tell you that there are times when there are problems on the network. And we will do our best from the distributor's point of view to let you know as soon as possible. Just explains those kind of aspects. Metering, we've also discussed. Section D is the legal aspects. That's really boring stuff, but the stuff that can bite you. Rights of way, ownership, assignment and change in control. So also who's responsible for communication. Force majeure, that means an event that causes, similar to the next line, damage or system outage or something under which either party cannot fulfill their requirements under the contract. And this is typically something really big that you wouldn't design for or anticipate under normal conditions. So acts of God, for instance, fall under there. That's like major storms or a really freak accident. I'm not even going to mention the one that comes to mind now. What was a freak accident? Okay. Under which conditions can the point of supply be disconnected, the contract be terminated, and the rest is typical legal requirements. Then a little bit more interesting again, the appendices, and actually a municipal budget quote letter. I think that's just for future reference. There you can see the system operations manual, generator connection particulars, so where is it connected, what's the Munix equipment, the quality of supply, there's a quality of supply, and then the standard for interconnection is similar to the document that Andrew has just discussed. So operations manual, some of the information is who can be contacted. So this is over and above potential SCADA and other fast communications. This is meant for people-to-people communication mostly. Then connection particulars. This is physically what's the size, what's the voltage where it gets connected. And you also have a typical single line diagram where you would define. This is the point of connection. This side is the distributor's equipment. That side is the generator's equipment. Make sure that every point that you reference in the agreement is shown clearly here so that there can't be a dispute later on. Some document, then the quality of supply. And remember, we said that you need to tell the customer what the emission limits are. Once again, there are reference parameters. You reference your obligations as the distributor, and that's maintaining basically the 048 series. It's not just part 2. There's also the part 4, which is the guideline. Part 6 is how does the distributor report and manage interruptions, things like that. Okay, the 047 is also included here. What is the response times in informing your customer of interruptions? What's the customer's obligations? That's mostly the emission limits. And this is just an example for smaller generators, less than 5 MVA, what the harmonic current emission table could look like. This comes from the IEC 62717, which is referenced in the grid code as well. And some management issues aspects. How would you manage the power quality? How would you measure it? And what are the remedial actions? Okay, so that was just very quickly running through the document. If anybody wants to look at it, it is on the website. See if I can.
Yeah, we'll share the link.
Share.
Yeah, we'll share it. You can continue. Maybe just a quick question. Oh, if you have it, then please. Yeah, I think it was it was one of the links in the emails that we've sent.
Yes, it was.
Yes, I'll just share it again that everybody has it. Thanks.
So pretty much at the bottom there's Eskom standard. We'll find it there. Okay. And that's it from my point of view on terms of the agreements. I think the important agreements is that connection agreement and operational agreement, and self-build where that option is chosen. We're probably going to need the wheeling agreement. I'm not sure how many customers you've had that wants to wheel. And just be aware of possible updates that require to the connection agreement of customers when there's wheeling, even if it's from a different distributor, as well as update to the connection agreement with Eskom. Okay, thank you.
Gerard, while we're waiting for any comments or questions, just out of interest, is there anyone in the audience where there was a scenario where you had to curtail generation or switch it off to stabilize the network? I'm not talking about that there's a fault condition and for that reason you disconnect it because they're not complying or there's a fault issue. Just the curtailment or changing the power generation or even maybe changing the power factor for that, would be also a scenario. Just want to know, especially for the metros and the guys that possibly has some form of SCADA or control capabilities. Is there anyone in the audience that had to do that before? Mark, you know someone.
I don't. Maybe while people are thinking, I can just comment quickly on the chat. So I asked in the chat whether stating that Cape Town's got their own generator standard, and asking what the main differences were, what they felt they needed to change to make it appropriate for their situation. And I see Ismail's responded saying that it didn't. Eskom standard doesn't specifically cater for the smaller generators, specifically 5 MVA and less. So they did change that in their own standard, and that is something we should possibly look at, is seeing to what extent it might make sense to use the Cape Town standard, because it has been thought through from a distributor point of view, whereas the Eskom one hasn't necessarily. That's all I wanted to say. So we should investigate that in future, Gerard.
Yes, that sounds good.
Agree. No, I think after watching Eskom's presentation, you could clearly see it's mainly focused towards your large-scale IPPs above 20 megawatt. And for them, these things are, quite standard and I want to say straightforward. But for the projects we're realizing, one needs to be quite specific on what's really necessary. Okay, any other questions, comments? The reason why I'm asking about the controllability is I thought there might be one or two that was the case, but I do foresee it is going to start happening as we see more generation coming online. So, okay, Shiraz just making a statement. Okay, but it's good to have those clauses and that capability because we never know what's going to happen in future. Okay, any other feedback? Gerard, would the next step be the checklist activity? I don't know if you have a scenario that they can apply to.
Maybe just a quick comment on what Shiraz has said there. it's not as much as control of the generator, sending a signal, this is what I want you to do. Because, okay, you don't have to give the reason when you send that signal, but you will do that because there's been some other contingency in your network or something that's happened that now results in a problem on a part of the network that can be fixed if this generator just reduces the power output or changes the power factor or something like that. And so that's, you are controlling your network by asking for external inputs to change. And that is also a requirement in the grid code that these generators must be able to do that. So maybe that is what you had in mind, but I just wanted to make that difference, or draw that difference. The checklist. Like you said, Cora, this is quite a checklist. Going back to C, that was 1, 2, 3, and there starts section 4 with the agreements on the contractual. We've got all the agreements here listed. That was also in the presentation. And then it goes to the environmental aspects, but I think we did look at it on yesterday. So that's why it's quite a list. So let's see. No, I don't actually have an example. If we want to adapt that. Just give me 2 seconds, please.
Okay, while Gerard is sorting that out, Ina, thank you for sharing that resource. So Cape Town, they've offered the standard for interconnection of embedded generation link from City of Cape Town. I'll also just, Ina, would you mind sharing that on the WhatsApp as well? I think you're on the WhatsApp group. Otherwise, I can do that for us. Gerard?
So if we, yes.
Okay, you're ready. You're ready. Otherwise, remember, I still got that Menti, hey? So, but it's up to you.
Okay, we can just assume that we still look at this network here, where we're going to upgrade these 2 lines and the transformer. Make them all red. And we assume that we've got our generator here, this point. And he's just either self-consuming or he's pushing electricity back into the grid. Which of the agreements are you thinking is going to be applicable in this case? So that's the Google link for it.
Correct. I'm sending it now. So I think let's apply the question of, what agreements are you of, in your view, would be applicable? And Gerard, there might be a few questions of, where's this generator? Is it a rooftop installation? And what's the size of the generator? Is it in the open field? Especially if I'm thinking about the environmental aspects. The environmental authorizations.
So basically, I would say that that's a customer that's adding a generator, but it can also now feedback, and it's for self-consumption. So what size? Let's make it let's make it a 3 megawatt generator.
Gerard, it seems like I've sent the wrong link. I've sent step 5. It should be step 4. My mistake. I'm just going to correct that quickly, but please continue.
Okay. So if we assume that's a 3 megawatt generator, mostly self-consumption. So in essence now, which of these agreements are you going to put in place and which are you going to not need? Everybody clear on the question? Well, is allowed to export. So let me just add it. Export allowed. So we've have an existing customer here connected in the network. They are now applying to add a new generator, which is going to be 3 megawatts of PV generation behind their meter. They are allowed to export, which means electricity can flow back into the network, either direction. But on average, they are doing self-consumption. So it's not sized so that they export excessively and the net consumption is still consuming. So which agreements would you put in place for this scenario? Now there's going to be an option yes, and not applicable, or not sure. So if you're not sure, mark the not sure. If you think it's not applicable, then just say not applicable.
Yeah. And if you
Otherwise,
if you have any questions regarding the scenario, like Mike also asking, is it a rooftop PV or ground mounted? Then please ask me, because we can clarify that, because I think that will have with the environmental authorization, Gerard, in terms of if it's a certain area, beyond a certain area, then that might kick in.
Let's make it ground mounted.
Okay. Could you maybe also indicate the area that this plant would be, Gerard?
Well, typically you need about 1.7 hectares per megawatt of PV. So you can multiply that by 3.
Good.
What is 1.7 times 3? About 5.1 hectares.
So you're asking us to remember back to yesterday's presentation on the environmental authorizations, etc. And I find my mind is quite loaded with information. So if anyone else is struggling, then I'm with you.
Mark, why do you want to give them a easy out here?
Well, there might be some old people like me, and we don't want to be harsh on our elderly, you know.
Oh, come on. No. Yeah, that's. Do you want me to pull up that slide from yesterday?
No, I think going through it will probably remind people, you know, it's not a case of getting it right. It's a case of, yeah, trying to get your mind a bit back into that gear. And when
Yes.
you go through it, we will be reminded of it. So that's fine.
Mm. Okay, got 9 responses so far. Gerard, there's a question of what is the spatial attributes again?
Okay, so for PV, one can work with a rule of thumb of about 1.7 hectares per megawatt.
That's not ground mounted, eh?
Well, that's, yeah, that would be roof mounted as well.
If it's elevated compared to installed parallel or flat.
That's a very big rule of thumb. I guess if you do the not elevated, it's the slanted installation, you might come away with a little bit smaller area.
Did we
But
say
remember,
this one was ground mounted or roof mounted? That has a sort of impact on some of the possible land use authorizations and that sort of thing, and rezoning.
yeah, it's ground mounted, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Francis asking about area, age, forestry close to water.
France.
The questions that you're asking is allowing me to ask you that question.
Yes, I know. Let's say it's, yeah, there's close to water. There's a dam not too far away. And there are trees, but typical, slightly rural areas. It's not a forest.
Could you just list that?
Okay. Remove this. By the trees, I mean like the farmers typically plant all of these eucalypts and cypress trees as windbreaks, that kind of thing. Area, no, it's not in a heritage sensitive area.
Okay, we're sitting at 27 responses. I think I'm just going to wait until we got like the, yeah, I think let's give some time because I really would like people to apply their mind on the checklist. Okay, I think statistically we've got a good representation of opinions. Gerard, can I share? Right, so let's have a look. First one in terms of agreements and all contractual steps is the implementation agreement, which I think everybody said yes, that's there. Gerard, could you just help us here? What is the difference between the implementation agreement and other agreements? You know, use of system agreement or connection agreement.
My understanding is that the implementation agreement is really sort of up front, so that people have an overall idea of what is going to happen, what are the processes, what are the timelines, at which point do we need to finish something, this or that.
Okay, so how the project is going to be executed by the different parties.
Yes.
Okay, great. So the next one is letter of consent for use of distribution network. So most of the people said they yes. So obviously you need to give that letter of consent for them to be able to connect. PPA, there's a little bit of discrepancy there. Half of the group said yes, the other said not applicable or no. What would you say there, Gerard?
Okay, we just started with load shedding, so the PPA. Well, given that this is actually, it is a customer that's adding a generator, I wouldn't use a PPA because he doesn't have an end customer somewhere else. It is for his own consumption.
Okay, so in your case, you would say it's not applicable, right?
Yeah, I would say it's not applicable.
Yeah. I'm going to throw a spanner in the works. I know of some EPC or service providers where they put the plant on your premises and there would be a PPA between the generator or the owner of the plant and the consumer. If that was the case, then the PPA would be indicated here as well? Or would this be purely a PPA, you know, between the generator and the distributor?
No, the PPA is between any two parties, and with the MFMI, etc., the PPA with the municipality is actually not so
easy.
easy. You have to be very careful. So typically the PPA would be between the generator and another customer somewhere. So yeah, but and your example would be a good example.
Okay, so it could go both ways. It could be that they own the plant, there's no PPA, but or they finance the plant themselves, or they got financing from the bank, or it could be a generator that owns the plant, they sell the electricity to that person over 10 or sometimes I even heard 7 years. 7, 10, or 20 years, and there might be an option for taking over ownership or buying out the ownership. So, okay, but that's something to check for. I think you need to confirm this upfront to understand if there's a PPA or not. Okay, connection agreement. I think there's consensus there. One person said not applicable. I think it's important that there needs to be a connection agreement because of all the technical requirements, the tariff implications, and so on. Yes. We've got the supply. Although isn't the supply agreement wouldn't these two be combined together, or that one supplement replace the supply agreement?
Yeah, in my opinion, the supply agreement is actually replaced by the connection agreement.
Yeah, in my view, in the past it was always a supply agreement because utilities supplied power, but because the power can actually flow in both ways, they're not just it's not just a supply thing. It's actually more than just supply. Hence the connection agreement. So it makes provisions for supplying or absorbing power if there's excess power. And then the last one is use of system agreement. Oh, no, it's not the last one. There's another one that I can't see now. Oh, there we go. I thought it was a few. Okay. Use of system agreement. Most said yes. Operations agreements, agree. Wheeling, not applicable, which I think we all agree on because there's no wheeling of power. So there's no wheeling agreement. There's no trading agreement because whatever is being generated is used on site, so it's not applicable. PPP, no, it's all private, so there's no public involvement there. And then other, we could just maybe just see. Okay, most say it's not applicable. Let's just look at the comments. If there's any unforeseen circumstances, many gaps to rectify, wheeling and PPA not applicable because they remain a net consumer. Let's just see what's legal. I think that might be another one that they want to add. PPA not required if customer doesn't export. Okay, what tariff will be used should the customer export when consumption is very low? I think that tariff would be like standard export tariffs, similar to SECG, basic EIA required course of area coverage of 1 hectare. I think that will come later in the different questions. And then there's a not sure point as well. Okay, so that's the first section. Please stop me if there's something that's not clear or somebody wants a comment or Gerard, you want to say something. If we look at environmental and land use, environmental authorization and environmental management, everybody said yes, that should be part of the package. Water use license, entitlement, most people said there yes. Gerard, is that the case? The water use license?
Water use, I don't actually think a PV plant would have much water use license.
Yeah.
But I'm speaking under correction there.
Yeah, so obviously if they have a borehole or something like that for cleaning the water, or if they're going to pump out of the dam for cleaning the panels, then yes. Otherwise, it would be not applicable, in my view, but it's open for interpretation. Biodiversity permit for the restricted activity, most people said yes. Heritage, we said there's no heritage site, so it should be not applicable. National Forestry Act, most people said yes because of the trees. But Gerard, you pointed out it's just some, what's the word? Alien species.
The windbreaks, yeah, the windbreaks and stuff.
Yeah, so it's no official forest, just some planted trees. Although some people say they need to check for that, and then some people said not applicable. I think something I just would like to highlight here, the challenge with these approvals is that a lot of these things are not necessarily utility orientated. A lot of these things are from different departments or different, responsibility areas. We just listed this as a municipality just to check that, did the customer or the generator look into these things, to make sure, and this is something that they have to do at the end of the day. It's depending on if it's applicable or not. So just keep that in mind. It's not a case of you now need to go and apply for a heritage exemption or anything like that. This is just to help you check what's missing. Let's see what's the comments. There's a part of any licensing needed like mining. Don't think they're gonna mine. Not sure if these acts. Yeah, so it is from, yeah, like I said, they're all new. The extent of the connection and land or which the PV plant will be constructed will be determined for the EIA. VULA, not sure what that means, and whether the National Forest Act will be triggered. Ultimately, the customer will remain responsible for these applications and approval, and that's true. So we're just listing it here. So again, if the customer or the developer installs these projects and they look at the guideline, then they know, you guys are gonna check these things, but it's ultimately up to them to resolve that. EIA most probably not applicable for small 3 MVAs. Sorry, Gerard?
No, Ina has just commented the VULA is the Water Use License Act.
Aha. Okay.
And maybe before you continue there, I would be comfortable if you bounce these things back to the customer. And let's say the Water Use Act. So, but you haven't shown me that you're compliant or have the necessary authorizations or whatever. And it's then for them to come back from somebody, either an environmental expert or somebody who's registered. So, okay, I don't need to get anything. There's the proof. So I would say that's reasonable. And over time, you would also have a better idea of what is what without it from experience. But Ina, thank you for that. She said that there's a lot of these that actually depends on the entire solution. For instance, that water use license assessment depends on if you cross a wetland with some of your distribution infrastructure.
Great, thank you for that insight, Ina. Okay, so and then EIA most probably not applicable for small 3 MVA. Will be predominantly roof-based, similar for all the other ones, more applicable on bigger IPPs. So because it's a ground-mounted system and it's above 1 hectare, that typically triggers an EIA. Although I don't know if somebody
simplified one, yes.
For what's that now?
It's the simplified one, yes.
It's simplified.
It's the basic environmental assessment is required.
Okay, I got you. Sorry, but I do know that they have relaxed some of these EIA requirements, and I don't know if they actually increased that area of what it's required, or is the simplified version the relaxation?
I think that's part of it, and the other thing is that they've identified areas where you expect to have issues. So if you're within the safe areas where there's no big issues, then you can do the simplified one easier.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's just continue because I see we're over time already. Land and site related authorizations. Most people say subdivision of agricultural land, National Building Regulations and Standards Act, and the Municipal Site Specific Land Authorization. For rezoning or zoning, to check if that's sorted out. Gerard, you would like to comment on that, on this scenario, or the one you have in mind?
Yeah, no, we really don't go into detail on this. So for now, I think let's just continue.
Okay. We've got astronomy, geographic advantage. Not most people say not applicable. Civil Aviation Acts. They mix feelings between yes and not. My experience is that where this typically becomes important is if you're close to airport, then this starts to become important. Or if you have a build, installing something above a certain height.
So like wind facilities.
Yes.
Which the
Then that
question
would be.
states.
So yeah, so sorry, yeah, I see that now. Approval for wind facilities. So in this case, obviously not applicable. Mineral Petroleum Resource Development Act. So obviously, I think it's for different types of generation, other types of generation. We call Electronic Communications Act, and then DMRE era section 34. So this would be not applicable, hey? I mean, the municipality is not part of the not the municipality. They don't need ministerial determination for these projects. Let's just quickly see the comments. All the customers check and confirm whether this plant will trigger any of these authorizations, which is true. Munich is not responsible for this authorization on behalf of the customer. Most should be applicable to the PV installation. Yes, 100% right. So in a way, we're trying to cover all of our bases, hence why it's listed this comprehensive list of authorizations and consents as well as agreements or approvals. But at the end of the day, it does go back to the developer or the installer to make sure that these things are in place. I think it's just to be aware as a utility to be sensitized to these. My understanding, Gerard, is that in the past, to acquire a NERSA license, and I'm not sure if it's for the registration as well, all of these things they would typically check for, or a lot of it at least. So, and now that's gone. So, in a way, we want to see if we could put checks and balances in place to make sure that the project doesn't go down because there's something outstanding. Is that right, Gerard?
No, actually, I don't think NERSA checked for everything, but there had to be some registered environmental person who, I'm sorry, I don't have the correct terminology now, who would sign off on all of these other requirements. What would happen in practice is these big IPPs have got the banks funding the development, and those banks know very well what needs to happen. They've got enough people to check everything, and they do check it, because if you spend that kind of money, you don't want to end up getting into trouble because of one little thing.
Great. Okay, thank you, Gerard. Okay, so I think we've come to the end of our session for today. There is a quiz. I see we're already over time. So there is a quiz with a few questions for today, which you guys can do either now if you do have time, or you can do that